Welcome everyone to the second day of the Iowa Hunger Summit. Today we have a panel, What Does Hunger Mean to Our Workforce? And I am so pleased to welcome a number of panelists for a wonderful discussion. My name is Barbara Stinson. I am the new president of the World Food Prize Foundation. I've been here about 9.5 months and just so pleased to welcome all of you participating in the Hunger Summit and each of our panelists today. I want to start by just saying a little bit about the panel, and then I'll introduce all the speakers that you see here before you. So this session is really supported and brought about by Business Publications Corporation's initiative, Iowa Stops Hunger. What does hunger mean to our workforce? Iowa Stops Hunger is a new year-long statewide initiative with presenting sponsor Hy-Vee, and it was created by BPC to really drive awareness and action around hunger and food security in Iowa, especially in this really difficult year. So it's a 12-month initiative launched in June of this year with the goals of reaching Iowa's businesses, cultural and philanthropy communities, and much broader audiences to try to create ongoing awareness of food security and hunger issues here in Iowa. It's meant to educate Iowans and business partners and organizations about the food insecurity and hunger issues so many Iowans face. It's meant to inspire and equip businesses and individuals to take action to stop hunger in Iowa. So today, well, let me first introduce everybody so you can know everyone around the room. First, Chris Konecki is the publisher of BPC, publisher and executive editor. Georgia Van Gundy is Executive Vice President and Chief Customer and Talent Officer at Hy-Vee. Angela Walker Franklin is President and CEO of Des Moines University. Bob Riley is Chairman of Riley Resource Group. Jeff Russell serves as President and CEO of Delta Dental of Iowa. And Daniel Hoffman-Zinnel is CEO of Proteus Incorporated. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here today. Let me say just a little bit more about our panel discussion. So today what we're going to do is ask this panel of executive leaders from companies here in Iowa to explore how hunger and food security in Iowa touches our workforces, how it affects workers and therefore our overall economy. Today you'll learn more about how hunger affects families, individual lives at home, their productivity, and then ultimately the bottom line for our companies. Our leaders are going to share information, stories about how their companies are helping address hunger and food insecurity and what they're doing to support their workers. All of this meant to inspire other companies to do the same. Let me start then by introducing in more detail our moderator. Chris Konecki, as I said, BPC, publisher and executive editor. He has a long history of work in business media and organizations. BPC is a business media organization that publishes the weekly magazine that we all know so well, and a variety of digital products featuring local business news. Chris, you come to us from such a broad background. Thank you so much for being here today. Everybody can read more about all of our panelists right there in your platform below the agenda. And Chris, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. I appreciate it. And thank you for having us today as part of the World Food Prize event today. Again, my name is Chris Konecki. I'm the publisher and executive editor at the Business Record. And last spring, as the pandemic was in full swing and the shutdown was forcing layoffs and furloughs at historic rates, at the Business Record, we began hosting a variety of roundtables with community leaders in an effort to understand the needs of the community. One immediate need kept coming to the forefront, and that was food security. This summer, as Barbara mentioned, we began our Iowa Stops Hunger initiative to help educate and to help make sure that this not only was a short-term, not only while the this was really in the forefront, but that we were making sure that we were going to extend that throughout the course of the year to make sure that we are helping keep this at the forefront, because this isn't just a short-term problem, as you all know. This is something that it needs to be tackled over a long period of time. I'm excited to be here today as part of the initiative as we help support the World Food Prize and all the work that they do, and host a discussion about how this is affecting business, why it matters to our business leaders, and really spend some time illuminating how to engage with and perhaps better leverage the business community's resources to help with food insecurity. And I know we've got a great panel for you today to help us do that. I've got a variety of questions to ask the panelists today, and so I'm going to lead us through that. But if you have questions, I believe there's a button that will allow you to submit questions. I'll be able to see some of those on the back end. We'll try to incorporate those as we go throughout the process, so feel free to do that. If nothing else, that'll help guide the line of questioning today as well. Panelists, thank you for being here today. The first thing I want to spend some time on is helping to understand why business is involved in this issue. So our first question today that I'll have each of you answer is, why do you and your business believe that food insecurity is a business issue? And Angela, I'm going to go ahead and begin with you today.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be a part of the panel today. Of course, Des Moines University, as a health sciences university, has a steep tradition of meeting the healthcare needs of the communities that our students, our future providers, serve. As an educational institution, we have several different variables here that I'd like to just highlight in terms of why we believe this issue is so important for us. First, we are training future health professionals. So it's important for us to have them understand the impact of food insecurity, hunger. They're meeting the healthcare needs of the communities that they serve. They actually need to understand and have an appreciation for how best to support and promote wellness and actually supporting communities. From our employees, we have a workforce here on campus of our faculty and staff, and we also provide of care. So in terms of our employees, those who are clinical versus non-clinical, those who are in the classrooms teaching and training, all of them are important to us as our workforce, because wellness is a core value here. So we have wellness pays programming, we have a fitness center, we really promote health and fitness on campus. We as a campus community focus on the Partnership of Healthy America that promotes wellness, because if we really are truly focused on wellness, the body is not well if it's not properly nourished. So we at Des Moines University understand the importance of that and the value around wellness and how best to impart that in terms of the workforce of our community here and the training of future health professionals so that we prepare them to meet the healthcare needs. And then the final piece is all about community engagement. We as a campus community are promoting and really involved in community outreach and being of service to the community. So not only our students, but our faculty, it's important, it's sort of ingrained in who we are as an institution, that we are of service to the community. So our community goes out to support communities that need care, from food shelters to promoting food drives to being of service to underserved communities by going out and being a part of that and being of service.
Thanks, Angela. Daniel?
Sure. Well, thank you, Chris, and welcome to all of the rest of the panelists. Produce, we're a multi-state nonprofit that provides services specifically to agricultural workers and their families. We do that through providing affordable health care, education assistance, and job training. And I think especially now, we all have recognized the important role that agricultural workers play in all of our lives as essential workers, and really being a part of not only the agricultural economy, but helping put food on all of our tables. And so it's really important for us as an organization that really serves farm workers to make sure that they have all of the access to resources, including access to nutritious food, so that they can be productive workers and be able to get out there and work in the fields. These workers are the most hardworking, grateful people I have ever encountered, and they're working sunrise to sunset 7 days a week in many cases during the summer. And it's really critical for them to have access to food, because if they don't, that decreases productivity, it decreases bottom lines for the company and overall our agricultural economy. And so we as an organization really focus on the social determinants of health, really providing access to a variety of resources to increase their income, to increase access to healthcare, and overall increase access to nutritious food as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Bob?
Thank you, Chris. Welcome again to all the panelists and to our audience. I'm Bob Riley from the Riley Resource Group, which is a collection of agricultural-facing companies. And so we deal a lot with livestock and fertilizer and some of the other first-line producers of food and nutrition in the state of Iowa. As you can probably know from being familiar with this system, 1 in 6 Iowans is food insecure. And so it's pretty easy to apply that old 6 degrees of separation to know that all Iowans know someone who knows someone that's hungry. So no matter what your employment situation, someone within reach is probably hungry. And then if an employee has to worry about food and rent and other basic necessities, it will be impossible for them to focus on the work at hand. And focus is really what an employer buys. And this focus deserves a fair price. So if an employee is food challenged, it is certain that other challenges are pervasive, like medical, housing, clothing, education, all of which sap the emotional, intellectual, and motivational energy of the employee, which costs the employer many dollars in lost productivity. So when people wonder, where is the effect of hunger on your business, you have to know that no matter how those ripples end up, people know people that are hungry, people are related to people that are hungry, people are hungry, and with that, we end up with lost productivity and issues that pervade the workforce that we need to deal with. And so as employers, it's our responsibility to try to do something about this.
Thanks, Bob. Georgia?
Thanks, Chris. Well, obviously, with Hy-Vee, we deal with food. So Hy-Vee is, our mission is to make lives easier, happier, and healthier. In our 8 states, we have 276 stores, 174 C-stores, and 370 pharmacies and clinics. It's personal to us because we specialize in health and wellness. As a company, the health and strength of our communities has always been a top priority. Food insecurity impacts the children and citizens of these communities and causes angst, leads to more overarching community issues. Plus, like Angela talked about, we believe it's our civic duty that people don't go hungry. And we've been participating in a lot of different opportunities, which I know we'll get to later, where our employees have the opportunity to engage within the communities on this issue in particular. But there's a lot of activity that we have always done around food insecurity and continue to do going forward.
Thanks, Georgia. Jeff?
Thanks, thanks, Chris, and appreciate being on the panel. From Delta Dental's perspective, I feel like maybe we're a little bit new to this conversation. Obviously, as a health and wellness company, we provide dental and vision insurance to 1.2 million members. And over the last few years, as a health and wellness company, that we've tried to expand our focus from not only oral and vision health to overall health. And as we did that, our first focus was really around mental health. Obviously an important topic. And as we've gotten into the pandemic in particular, I think we've realized the importance of food and food insecurity related to overall health, as was mentioned. So if you look at our 3,700 businesses that we serve, we're in the Medicaid business, so we serve the state of Iowa and those members and 1.2 million members. What we realized is that if we weren't engaged in this conversation, we weren't fulfilling our entire mission around overall health and wellness. So I wouldn't say that we have the long history of that, but as we've thought about why is it an issue for business, Bob's number of 1 in 6, if you take 1.2 million members, that means 200,000, give or take, on any given day, have a level of food insecurity. And if they can't work through that, then obviously some of the other things that will promote their overall health and wellness probably don't get done as well. So that being said, we know that that our employees probably have issues with this as well. And certainly to Bob's point, they know somebody who does. And so as we looked at the pandemic, one of my favorite sayings around this is that when a crisis happens, does your team run away from the fire or towards the fire? And we thought this was probably one of the most important issues that we needed to run towards as we went into this time. So I'm anxious to learn from the panelists as well. And like I said, we're early in our journey and how we address food insecurity in the state.
And thank you all for your opening comments. And Daniel, I want to go back to something you touched on, and you talked specific about worker productivity. And obviously, some of the jobs that the employees that you're trying to serve are very physically demanding. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps what maybe you've seen in either the early stages or maybe as the pandemic has extended outward in terms of what you've seen as far as productivity?
Yeah, I think COVID definitely has thrown a wild wrench into all of our workforce, but especially within the agricultural community as a whole. Early on, we wanted to be as proactive as possible and create a very bold strategy to get testing out to as many workers as possible. And so ultimately that turned into a daily call we had with the governor's staff, IDPH, IWD, Homeland Security, and the State Hygienic Lab to create a robust strategy to get as many tests out as possible. And the whole goal was to mitigate spread as much as possible so that our workers who are coming in, thousands of migrants that are coming into our state, could continue to work fully. We did have some positives, but thankfully we had some funds to isolate them in hotels. Produce was able to pay for those, and we were able to bring them 2 hot meals a day, which I think was just the humane thing to do for our workers. Over time, we definitely saw workers that did test positive needed access to nutritional food in order to recover. So I think productivity as a whole was able to be pretty stable in Iowa because we were able to mitigate spread as much as possible. But I think access to the nutritional food definitely helped with recovery, and ultimately, knock on wood, we only had a few hospitalizations and no deaths that we were taking care of any farm workers. So I think we had a fairly successful summer in helping to make sure that our agricultural workforce was safe, had access to food and all of the resources they needed.
Georgia, you have at Hy-Vee such a diverse workforce, both folks on the floor in the stores, in offices. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how Hy-Vee's tried to approach that when it comes to worker productivity, when you've seen hunger perhaps within the workforce itself?
So just the dynamic with our people?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think, this is an issue that they work with each day, each store, just to give you a little bit of background of our structure. So each store, our store directors, it's autonomous. So then they manage the store the way that they want to. But this is a top of mind issue for all of our stores and here within our corporate office. So there's a lot of activity that they're doing themselves within the community and with their employees year round, to be honest with you. They've got locally, a number of them have relationships with their local food banks. Again, and that helps engage our employees in working with those food banks. And then also from us, from a corporate perspective, we've been doing a lot of work with food banks and others and food rescue, again, for quite some time. I'll tell you where it's been interesting for our employees as well, is especially during COVID and then also during the derecho. Just making sure that people did have food during these times. So for example, we did a fresh produce contactless drive-through giveaway where we had 115 events. So we had nearly 100,000 pounds that were donated, more than 1.3 million pieces of produce. And so that's something that our people worked with in their communities to get that out for folks. We had more than 1 million in supplies donated to 17 Feeding America food banks. So that included nearly 450,000 to 4 Iowa-based food banks that support all 99 counties, just as an example. So like I said, there's a lot of initiatives that we do all the time. And I think that in the stores for our employees look out for each other. And so I think they're always looking for ways to support if they know that our employees have some type of issue within the food insecure space to take care of them.
Jeff, you mentioned being relatively new, but that you had put a lot of effort behind mental health. I imagine the connection between mental health and food security makes for an easy entry point in some ways to try to figure out. Can you talk a little bit about maybe that dynamic at play in your decision to get involved into helping with food insecurity?
Yeah, I think over the past few years, as we look to expand kind of our philanthropic efforts and how we help support communities, it seemed like mental health was obviously it's a huge issue in the state. And as we got into the pandemic and sort of what can we do to help, the first thing we realized was that we really needed to help shore up some of these nonprofits who are really focused on some of the things Georgia was talking about around food insecurity and that. And so that was really the focus of our, first effort in the spring of about 360,000 was turned out to be about $500,000 donations to, on the boots on the ground kind of organizations, from what I would call a closet food pantry to the biggest food bank in the state, or other people who are working on some of the social determinants that Daniel was talking about. So I think what it really said is, okay, if we're going to be about the overall health and wellness of the people that we serve, that's really the base level. And so how do we sort of pivot there in this time? I mean, it's really sort of opened my eyes, at least I think our eyes as an organization, to really what the issue is. Our corporate offices are in Johnston, and you might suggest, urban or suburban Des Moines doesn't have those issues. And actually, even before this last year, we were working with United Way and about the number of students that take backpacks home with food for the weekend because they're food insecure. And so I think it touches all pieces of our community. We might look at one piece or another piece, but what we realized was that if I think to an earlier point, if we can't deal with the issue around food insecurity and the people have the proper nutrition, their ability to live a overall healthier and happier life is kind of unlikely.
You mentioned the economic effect perhaps on a business, and there's also the human element. And so one of the things that I think maybe we've, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but when we try to talk about this, there's obviously an effect on business, an effect on your bottom line component. And there's also this really real human element. Can you talk a little bit maybe about that dynamic and how you've tried to approach that with your company?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at, again, I'll just go back to the numbers. So 1.2 million members, if you just use Bob's 1 in 6 number, it means 200,000 of our customers are addressing some level of security on a daily basis. Part of the value proposition that we offer to businesses is to help their employees become more productive, right? Preventive visits around dental, preventive visits around vision are all part of being healthier overall. And so I think that, from a philanthropic effort, we've realized that, there's probably this hierarchy of needs, if you will. And if you can't address the food insecurity component, you're unlikely to get to the other pieces that are in that world. So, again, I think we're trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. When we talk about efforts, one of the things that we did during the pandemic is obviously dental offices and vision offices to some extent were closed down during most of some of March and April and May. And we gave premium credits back to our group of customers, insurance customers, and our individual customers. For our individual customers, one of the things we said is, okay, how can we get them involved in this conversation? It's one thing for us to spend foundation and corporate dollars around this. And so, our average premium is $30 per individual per month. So if we gave, 50% credit, that might have been, $15. 2 months, that's $30. What we decided to do was if they wanted to donate that money to the Food Bank Association of Iowa, so all the major food banks we distribute that to, we'd match that money. So I think part of that was about how do we get people involved in this conversation on a small level where we can use some of our resources to match that, and we're able to do that. We got great response to that. That at a time when people were probably not paying attention, candidly, to one little premium credit of their dental or vision premium. But we thought that was one way to get people involved. And I think that's probably the broader conversation is how do we do that, writ large amongst corporations, businesses, and individuals across the state.
Bob, when we spoke a little bit about this, and you talked a little bit about how a lot of times efforts are focused at where the need is most when it's present, right? Trying to solve hunger at its when it's needed. you talked about the systematic situation around that is leading to that, and how to approach that. And from your perspective, and I know the way you think as a business guy, what's your approach when you're trying to think about tackling this from a longer term perspective rather than just on the actual need delivery?
Well, that's a complex question because it's a systemic issue. I mean, when you think of what's going on in America today and the kind of the collective PTSD that everybody is suffering from, and the chaos that's going on, there's a phenomenal uncertainty about the future with this pandemic, with a trade war, with this, with that. And so I think a lot of people feel that there's this loss of locus of control. And that provides all this anxiety, and that children will not succeed, and that money will be insufficient, and time is our enemy. I mean, there's all kinds of things that wrap around this problem that are interrelated. And therefore, we have to look at them all as a system. It's always the old saw of give a man a fish, or teach a man to fish, is okay for the moment, but it doesn't really address the systemic issues that we have in our system. And so really we need to look at the root causes of some of these issues. And in my mind, a lot of it results around poverty. If we don't have the right systems in place in order to allow people to have a living wage in our society, then we've got a real problem that is going to be almost impossible to fix, because it will require so many more band-aids without fixing the systemic issue. We're going to end up with just always doing a whack-a-mole trying to figure out how to fix this. I remember the quote from FDR that said, "No business which depends for its existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." And by living wage, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean that the wages of decent living. And I think that's probably one of the things that I look at in our systemic look, that because of the inability to have enough money to pay for the basic necessities of life. Jeff talked about that Maslow's hierarchy. Until we deal with the bottom tier of food and shelter and clothing, until people are comfortable in that area, we can't start talking about other things that are higher level accomplishments. And so we have to make sure that our system is set up to cover all those things at the bottom in some fashion or another, and not play this low road capitalism game of trying to get the cheapest we can get in terms of labor and wages, but instead try to figure out how much can we pay our employees and still do a good job managing our expenses to provide for low cost items. But at that point, you now have the recipe for covering a lot more of the basic necessities than what we've had before.
I've always liked you talk about polarities all the time, and I've always liked that idea of it's not one or the other. It's not holding the canned food drive or working on the systemic problem that's going to have a result many years down the line. But I think if I'm a business, what advice, and I'll open this up for the whole panel, what advice would you have for other businesses that are maybe looking to start and get involved in some fashion? Yeah, Angela?
I would just, and I couldn't agree more with what Bob just said there in terms of the systemic issues around poverty and hunger. People don't have the resources to be able to live a healthy life. If the body's not well because it's not properly nourished. So that's just fundamental. In terms of things to do, just from our vantage point here as a higher ed institution, we have 4 vision statements about who we are as an institution and our way forward. And it's all about educational excellence, clinical excellence, research excellence. But the one most pertinent to the conversation today is all about advocacy and civic engagement and public policy around the social determinants of health. So in terms of those Band-Aids, we need a lot of those Band-Aids. We need to have everyone doing their part to help stop the bleed. Unfortunately, given what's happening in the world today, it's going to get worse. So I would agree. We all need to be working on all of these things all at the same time, but getting everyone to agree is part of the challenge. Does everyone agree that the issue is really around poverty, and how do we best address that? So just some of the things that we're doing here. Wellness is a core value. We indoctrinate that into our campus community. When our students and employees arrive, they hear about that. Just as an example of something that we do here, our students get points for community service. Our students are pretty amazing at how they go out and be of service to the community. They see this as a basic need. We now even, for our orientation, we bring in meals from the Heartland. Day one on campus as a new entering student, they are indoctrinated into being of service to the community. Our employees get 16 hours of paid community service leave to go out and be of service. We have partners in the community, whether it's Food Bank of Iowa or United Way. Those partners are a part of who we are as a campus community, and we support them. So it's really important for our students to hear about it and understand it when they come to our campus, but our employees also. So that's how we are putting those Band-Aids on to try to stop the bleed in the small way that we can here. But I think if others join with us and become a part of trying to fix the problem, while someone else is trying to deal with the issues around the systemic issues around poverty, we're all in this together. We've all got to do our part to address the needs that are out there.
I'll add on to part of what Angela said. I think as a business, I think you need to find something that is sustainable and thoughtful. I think that people can engage in, and then things break off from them. That, as I mentioned before, health and wellness is important to us. I would give an example for Hy-Vee. We have our One-Step program. So Hy-Vee One-Step products help improve the well-being of our communities around the world. So if you buy these products, they help feed hungry, in which we take some of those dollars and participate, for example, in Meals from the Heartland. We build wells. We do other civic projects around communities from that One-Step program in particular. But then the other things, we try to be innovative. We have our healthy U-mobiles, which are going out to the communities and providing flu shots and different things like that. And we're leveraging them also for food insecurity. So we're really trying to sit down and think about the different resources that we have, other than the things that we have done, and be more innovative to bring solutions to those communities that don't necessarily have solutions being brought to them, whether they're more of your rural communities or just some of your, like I think about, it's kind of interesting. So we have a Fast and Fresh, which is one of our C-stores, and it's in a part of Des Moines that I would say is more of a food desert. So our Fast and Fresh, when I say it's a convenience store, it really is where you can go in and get a lot more grab and go food, and also freshly prepared food. And it's gone crazy, but it's a great example of that was an area that had a food desert. So we're bringing lower cost solutions to communities that don't have those solutions within them, as far as just a business model. And then these other things that I talked about are more from our civic and community perspective, but really being thoughtful and sustainable than with something like our One-Step program that we have.
Chris, if I can add on to that, I think one of the other interesting things about this is, certainly there's the conversation around hunger and food insecurity. From a business perspective, there's also this idea about nutrition and eating well. I think that's where Georgia was going a little bit. So I think one of the things businesses can do is start to promote that in their own business, right? The idea about the overall health and wellness starts with nutrition. I have the pleasure of being on the Healthiest State Initiative board, whose goal is to make Iowa the healthiest state in the country. Our obesity numbers are pretty bad. They're 48th to 49th in the country in terms of that. And a program that we have around Double Up Food Bucks, which is a partnership with the state, with USDA, Hy-Vee, Fairway, and some other private businesses from funding perspective. provide, if you're on SNAP, the Supplemental Assistance Program, and you buy $1 of fruits and vegetables, you get a coupon for $1 the next time you're there in fruits and vegetables. And being able to help folks eat healthier in that environment, I think has been good. The reality of that is that we were provided about $1 million in CARES funding through the state, and that we went through that with Fairway and Hy-Vee across the state in about 75 days. So that shows, the demand that's out there for that. So these are people who are already spending some of their own dollars to leverage additional dollars. And I think that shows that. But I think part of it's not just about, that we need to have broader food programs, which we do, but what are we actually putting in our bodies collectively?
I'd like to weigh in a little bit. Georgia and I are the two people on this panel who are directly involved with feed and food. And so these are the areas that we can reach out through our networks and do more on the Band-Aid approach, at least, than anyone else. We work in our organization directly with other trade organizations, such as the Iowa Poultry Association, the Iowa Turkey Federation, Iowa Pork, and Iowa Cattle, in addition to private companies, to promote food programs. Again, many of these are Band-Aids, but they're the start of how we get this thing rolling. The one with which I'm most proud to be associated is the Iowa Poultry Association, sponsoring the Cracking Hunger approach, which contributes 46,000 dozen eggs per month to food banks and food pantries. That's over 550,000 eggs per month, or over 6.6 million eggs per year, going from Iowa egg farmers to hungry people. So these are the types of things that we can do through the Poultry Association. The pork folks have the same types of programs, same thing for turkey and cattle. So we're trying to fix these Band-Aid things to make sure that those are going in the right direction. Then when we're talking about the root causes and some of the systemic issues, that's where I'm working in the policy arena, trying to make people understand, as Jeff talked about, recognizing those root causes of hunger, the societal issues found in basically low road capitalism, where we end up with an inability to have equitable wages for people to get out of the poverty that causes this whole cycle to start.
Daniel, it looked like you had a comment as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the one thing that I would encourage all businesses to do is to lead with racial equity. I think looking at the One Economy report, we see the intersection of race and income and how systemic racism has plagued our community and our country for the last 400 years. And so I think there's a really important component of really leading with racial equity, thinking about the postmodern slavery era that we're in and how it's still connected to slavery. So I won't get into full detail on that, but I would encourage you to just look up postmodern slavery era to learn more about how our current system is still connected with slavery and how it has built this country. So that's my recommendation. Check out the For Equity tool. It's a great tool for business leaders to use when making important decisions. But I think it's important to acknowledge our past as business leaders, acknowledge maybe wrongdoings or things we've done wrong, to develop trust by sharing that vulnerability so that we can move forward with these important conversations.
It's a really good point, Daniel. Thanks for bringing it up, especially when you look at the way, of course, that this is affecting, you can't just look at it as the whole population. Looking very specifically at different segments of the population and how they're affected, of course, is so important with this. One of the things that I'm curious about is, oftentimes Bob, you gave some examples of some good partnership opportunities and some ways that businesses are partnering in. When you're approached about different opportunities, what are some things that would help an initiative potentially be something that you'd be wanting to get involved in, and maybe think about putting that through the lens of all the great organizations around the state that are working on these issues, that are maybe trying to bring an ally like a business on board to help support or fund. And Jeff, maybe I'll start with you through the Dental Foundation, especially since you guys have made a bit of a change in how you're delivering some of those things.
Yeah, so as we look from our foundation's perspective and where we, are focused, we've recast our strategic plan. I think everybody was in the process of this 2020 visioning process, but two, I think, important things. One is this idea of focusing on overall health. At some level, that becomes how do you create a program that ends up being sustainable over time? Like, what is the sustainability of it? Obviously there are programs that need to be funded every year, and certainly we understand that. But are there opportunities to create sustainability, partnering with government, partnering with other foundations, partnering, with businesses? I'll use like Double Up Food Bucks with Hy-Vee and Fairway. They do in-kind matches in that environment to be able to do that. So that becomes a more sustainable program over time. We too have taken a look from an equity lens, and I think that when we look at those things, so not only racial equity, but other barriers to health in that, and kind of getting back to the social determinants component of health around that. So I think to some extent, and maybe the third one, if I can say that, is that you're not reinventing the wheel. I think sometimes, there's this idea that says, well, let's go do our own program that looks like this, as opposed to partnering with others that are doing that to create better scale. I mean, we talk about that on the business front all the time, that you've got to be able to create scale to be sustainable at some level. And I think that, there's lots of need in the world. I think the question is how are people addressing that in a way that can be sustainable, that's not reinventing the wheel, and that allows us to feel like we can actually move the needle on this issue, as opposed to maybe put some Band-Aids on it.
I'll open that same question up to anybody else that wants to chime in on ways that perhaps folks could approach business. Georgia?
Yep, I'll just echo what Jeff said. I do think it's something that's sustainable. And, so for example, even our partnership with Business Publications, I mean, it's something that we just wanted to elevate the issue from a public relations, public affairs perspective, so that it's just more top of mind. So that's getting the issue out there. And then you have your activation part of it, So for example, I think I mentioned briefly, but we have food bank partnerships. So like during civil unrest, now this was in Minneapolis, but we had nearly 800,000 donated food supplies to area food banks and nonprofits. And we did a big stuff a truck event up there where we had that helped local nonprofits over 12 of the cities in that area. But we also can bring other people to the table. So in July, we had an in summer hunger event. We partnered with Kellogg's and Keurig's, Dr. Pepper. There's 1.5 million meals donated across 17 Feeding America food banks. So you can see there with that one, we had partnerships with some of our vendors that we have. And then also back to what Jeff said, which I think is important, is that it's a sustainable organization that has broader outreach. But then that's not to say that we wouldn't look at innovative opportunities as well. We've had somebody here more recently come to us with a innovative partnership with some different people that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think of, but then provides a greater reach and just an innovative way to maybe get food from our stores out to more people that need it. So again, an echo kind of what Jeff said, but just some examples as well.
Just going to offer too that clearly the group here today represents people with like minds, that we sort of have a united front. We represent organizations, businesses that all believe that this is an important thing to address. But there's this cognitive dissonance, and it was alluded to a little bit by Bob, that we are talking about a basic fundamental issue of feeding hunger, and food insecurity. We all can agree that there's a real problem out there, and there's systemic issues that are underlying all of this. But not everyone's necessarily saying the same things that we're saying today. So there's this disconnect from seeing what the real issues are and the real needs on one hand. And when you bring in issues around equity and Daniel's point of historically, there's some fundamental issues that have allowed things to evolve to this place. We got to be able to have that tough conversation to really address it and call it out. And then there are those who may not necessarily want to point fingers there or look to the past. We've got to have those difficult conversations around how it is that we are this country, the United States of America, and have still major issues around equity, major issues around food insecurity, not being able to have a livable wage. All these things are just fundamental, and it goes counter to who we say we are as an institution or a country. This cognitive dissonance is something that I think maybe needs to be at the forefront of this. So those of us with like minds sort of have this united front to be able to say, we all believe these things to be true. Therefore, we all can try to address them with the same voice. And sometimes I wonder if maybe we're not all speaking from the same song sheet.
That is so true, Angela. The recognizing those root causes of hunger. We can talk all we want all day long about organizing and getting really good at giving out a can of soup. But until we get into that root cause of those societal issues, basically starting with low road capitalism, which basically says winner take all in terms of an approach to economics, and it puts profits way before people and builds into our life, our everyday life, these socioeconomic divisions that have been established. So it's an equity issue, it's an historic issue. It stems from enslavement and goes continually this forward. What Daniel talked about having to do with this the modern approach to racism, and it's not just racism; it's a whole socioeconomic caste system that we've established, and that's why we're running around trying to find cans of soup. So until we fix the one, we will be continually chasing hungry people, trying to give them food to get them through the day. But they're going to be there tomorrow until we start fixing the system further upstream.
I imagine there are folks along a spectrum, right? And it might not necessarily be all the way resistant and all the way in total unity and support. And I would imagine focusing on this group perhaps might not be the place to put the initial energy. But if you're talking to that middle group, maybe they're not quite sure, or they haven't spent a lot of time considering it. What are some things that you would advise folks to use to help move them along that spectrum a little bit in terms of why this is so important to a business? If you were trying to make the case to somebody that maybe wasn't quite so sure.
Yeah, I'll just offer one suggestion. The phrase walk a mile in my shoes. You think about people need to be able to experience and understand what it feels like. Maybe you all did this, but we at DMU did the SNAP challenge. So we actually had our students, faculty, all trying to imagine what it means to live as an individual receiving SNAP benefits. And the difficulty of being able to provide a meal for your family on $4 a day, I think, which was about the amount. There was a different level of awareness and understanding of what it really meant to be hungry and not having enough resources to meet your family's needs. And I think that exercise alone on our campus raised a level of awareness so that people can really see that we're not talking about people gouging and taking more than they need, their fair share. They're just getting the basics, and even the basic doesn't go enough. So this idea of maybe trying to understand what it feels like and understand the experience of someone who is not just trying to be lazy and not work. There are issues and situations that cause them to be in this situation that they're in, that they're not able to provide. Walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
I think one thing Angela just said at the very end there that I think is important, and it's from a policymaker. So now I'm talking about having a lot of years working with policymakers, is that oftentimes people think that people who are on programs are not wanting to try to help get themselves better, which is definitely not true. And so I think the point that she just made there, it's I'll just give an example. Angela and I have worked, we've been on the United Way board together. And one of the issues that we've worked on is childcare assistance and making sure that lower income people have childcare assistance while they are trying to get raised and do better and not lose all of their benefits. And so when you're talking to a policymaker who doesn't even understand how much daycare is, like I'll have the conversation and they'll say, well, how much, is daycare? Well, it's, a couple $1,000s a month, depending on how many kids you have. And they're just floored because they don't understand that. And instead, sometimes the first thought is, oh, they just don't want to get off a program. And that's not true. And so I think it's really helping policymakers as well, Angela, you know, walk in those shoes and really understand what it is like. It's not people not wanting to get off of programs. It's sometimes there are barriers within those programs that they can't overcome to get off of them. And so just really helping them understand, policymakers is the them here, what that means and what it's going to take to help these people, individuals who are impacted, get off the programs like they want to.
Daniel?
I hate to make assumptions, but I picture the people who are maybe on the fence or maybe a little bit resistant are people that look like me. And so I would challenge them to think about themselves or their family. I'm a child of the 80s farm crisis who can still smell food stamps and went to WIC clinics on a regular basis as a child. And without programs like that, my family wouldn't have the access to resources they needed, and I wouldn't be sitting in this seat today. And so I think it's really about bringing Georgia and Angela's points to home of making that connection and sharing those personal stories of how it connects to them as an individual, but then also bringing in new stories to share about farm workers that we work with. They're the most hardworking people I have ever met, and they do this all always with a smile on their face to us. They're so resilient. They just want a better life for their family and for their kids. And so I think storytelling is going to be hopefully our biggest way of moving this forward.
Chris, I guess I'll just speak from our perspective. So, you know, my point of view is that while I'm sure there are folks that are resistant, I think, you know, what we've seen as we've had some of these natural disasters like the derecho is that Iowans want to help their neighbor. And I think that's true of the business community as well. I think sometimes it's, you know, we had this kind of issue when we started down the work around mental health, knowing it's a big opportunity, but where do you start, right? I mean, there's so many different pieces from a need perspective, and you want to make a systemic difference, right? We've talked about that. Where do you start? I think the food insecurity, sort of the overall food nutrition category is the same piece. I understand the policy component on that. But from a business perspective, I think you have to draw a pretty clear line between what is the issue and how do we help. And you know, luckily we have foundation staff that can dig in and talk to communities and understand where the best opportunity is for us to invest our dollars. But not every business has that, and I think that you know, that issue about where do you start is almost so overwhelming when you enter into a new arena that it's pretty easy just to go back to what you've done before because you understand it. I think the other piece, and again, I'll make a correlation to mental health here, is how do we sort of eliminate the stigma around food insecurity, right? So we've talked a lot, I think, in the state over the last few years about the stigma of mental health. Make It Okay is a program that the Healthiest State has started around mental health. How do we do that around food insecurity so that it's not that hidden issue of that, you know, that it's going to get taken care of by SNAP. Just let that be the issue. Let that be the answer. And so I think that piece around that, especially maybe in our rural communities, has an opportunity for us to continue to elevate the conversation.
Well, and I think that we need to look at, from a corporate standpoint in business, we need to look at what we can do to lead in this area, especially in the systemic side. Rich Harwood was just here in town. Suzanne Minnick brought him in, and he's got a book called Stepping Forward, which is local people in a grassroots area stepping forward to fix systemic issues. A few years ago, we had Sam Williams come to talk to the partnership. And his book, the CEO is Urban Statesman, determined that we couldn't get much done in Washington and we couldn't get much done up on the Hill here in Iowa. So it was probably up to the CEO of these companies that are prevalent in the area and have influence in the area to help fix some of these issues. So I think as a corporate person, it's our responsibility to really step forward and see what we can do to influence the policies that will allow this to dissipate over time so that we can fix this issue from in essence, from the top down and ground up.
Well, we are just about, we've got about 5, 6 minutes here. And so I want to give each panelist an opportunity to give a final closing thought. If you could maybe put that final thought through a lens of maybe something business could be doing, try to give a takeaway, something that maybe could help a business give that first step towards getting involved in some fashion. But feel free to give a final takeaway. While you think about your final takeaway, just a couple quick things that I want to make sure the audience knows about too, that we're involved in our next event in the Iowa Stops Hunger series that we're putting on that Barbara had mentioned is on November 4th. And we're going to specifically be addressing policy, some of the things that Bob has brought up today and that all the panelists have talked about, some of the policy drivers that lead to hunger. So that's going to be the focus of that event. It's free. You can sign up at iowastopshunger.com. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our monthly e-newsletter that we've started as a part of the Iowa Stops Hunger initiative to help raise awareness. That's going out to more than 10,000 business folks once a month. And it's collecting all the stories that we're providing throughout the course of the month that our newsrooms from both DSM and Business Record are reporting on. This is something that our team is spending a lot of time on to try to make sure we're helping raise awareness and bringing in all the different aspects to it. So we'd appreciate you considering signing up for that so that you and your team could be plugged in to this as well. Within there, there's also some easy ideas each month of ways that you could engage your team or yourself in this in some fashion as well. So we'd encourage you to take a look at that. All right, final question. And we're going to go ahead and we'll start with, let's go ahead and start with Jeff this time since we made you go last time. So Jeff, give us a final closing thought.
So again, thanks for allowing us to be on the panel. Again, I think as an organization, while we're experts in a number of things, this is an area we're not experts in. We've gone through this journey of exploration about what the issues are, what are the short-term issues, what are the longer-term systemic issues, how can we play a positive role in helping serve our communities. I would leave sort of from a business perspective, more of a personal point of view, which is it's pretty easy as a corporate leader not to do something that you're uncertain about. When you put yourself out there in terms of trying to get involved and you don't know what the issues are, that's a harder place to be than sort of the tried and true perspective. And my point of view, I think on this, and I think our learning as an organization is start somewhere, whether it's small, and begin to understand what those issues are. There are lots of great organizations that can help with that. And I would say, so, no matter how small, just start somewhere.
Bob?
Well, I'm always wondering, what do employers and the businesses they run have to do with hunger? That shouldn't be our realm per se, but it always is. Let me tell you the story that really resonates with me. I spied this farmer working in the field, and I could see that he was elderly and he was planting pecan trees. And I know that those are slow growing, and I asked, why do you plant them? And you probably will never live to gather a single nut from these trees. And the old man looked me in the eye and said, I plant these trees because all my life I've eaten pecans from trees that I did not plant. And so when we think of what we can do now for the future, we can plant the seeds of systemic change today and hope that as time marches on, that we can figure out how to make this work. Most people who are fortunate enough to attend this Hunger Summit are probably not working an extra shift so they could take time off to attend it. We're not close to those, yet we are connected. The 6 degrees of separation applies here. But the people who suffer the most aren't in the room, and they're shut out because of circumstances that are probably out of their control, but maybe in our control and in the control of the people that are watching this panel. So I would say, as Jeff says, do something as quickly as you can to fix the system that is as broken as it is, so that we can get to the bottom of this. Thank you.
Angela?
I would come from a position of representing higher ed and thinking first about the real value of education, not just health sciences, which is my institution, but in order to deal with some of the systemic issues we've talked about, having people to have access to opportunity whether it's in exposing and encouraging kids to think about, college and trade programs, training programs, to find a way to encourage and motivate individuals to be educated and trained so that they can make that livable wage. That would be an important message. Education is key to people being able to find their way out of poverty. And then from the vantage point of being of service to communities, we will forever be advocates for supporting communities, focusing on the social determinants of health, being of service from our students to our faculty, our staff, all given service to be able to be the Band-Aid to help in the small way that we can to meet some of the needs out in the community.
Thanks, Angela. Georgia?
Well, we don't talk about this a lot, but last year alone, we gave $54 million back in donations, and a lot of that is food. So it is something that we live and breathe every day here at Hy-Vee. So it's easy for us to think about this issue and become involved, and also to promote it, and working with those from an advocacy perspective. We could probably work a little bit more on the policy side of things, though, as I listen a little bit to this conversation. And I think things have already been said in this space. I mean, it's not, again, we live and breathe it every day here at Hy-Vee. So we know the connections to make, but they're not difficult to make in how you can work with people just to help them understand what programs are out there, have good partners. But I also do think it's important to figure out, as we've talked about here, how to be an advocate for those who, these are the people who don't, that typically are impacted by this, don't have a voice, don't have somebody who's really working with policymakers and other people to help them. And so it's great to give the money that we give. It's great to give the donations. And I'm always a fan of advocacy for those who don't have that voice. So it's how can we all figure out how to be that advocate for them as well?
Daniel, final thought. Wrap us up.
I'll try to be really brief. One thing we haven't talked about today, but I wanted to bring it front of mind for business leaders is immigration reform. I've been really proud of our business leaders for stepping up and really pushing for that. And I think it's so critical we move forward on that. Proteus, in partnership with Alexi Toe and American Friends Services Committee, have provided over $250,000 to immigrant families who don't qualify for governmental assistance with access to financial resources during COVID. And we have over $750,000 available right now. So if you know of any immigrant family that is in need, go to our Facebook and encourage them to apply.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you to all our panelists. Again, my name is Chris Kineski. If I can ever be of help, if our staff can ever be of any help, please feel free to reach out our way. Our news teams are working and reporting on this issue all the time. I'm going to turn it over to Megan, and a big thank you again to our panelists today. Megan?
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to the impressive executive leadership on the panel today, Angela Walker-Franklin, Georgia Van Gundy, Bob Riley, Jeff Russell, and Daniel Hoffman-Zinnel. This array of business represented in this group, I think, really demonstrates how hunger is not a single issue, and it's not a small issue. It's widespread and it's systemic. As Bob mentioned at the start of the panel, 1 in 6 Iowans are food insecure. I'm really heartened from this conversation by the programs that are underway currently and the ability to address those immediate needs, the Band-Aids that we discussed, as well as the deeper conversation that happened and needs to happen on the historic structures that have brought us to this place and the real need for policy change. As you all demonstrated today, there's an undeniable need for systemic change. And in order to accomplish this, we need the partnership, we need the community, and we need these difficult conversations partnered with action. So we really appreciate the leadership of the business community and the many resources that all of our speakers today mentioned. We're working hard to collect all of these resources and send them out to you, audience members, in our daily digest. So be on the lookout for that later today. Audience members, please continue to share your reflections in the chat below. And if you have any questions that you'd like to send directly to the speakers, you can use that Submit a Question to Speakers button. A final thank you to the Business Public Corporation for organizing the panel today and for their initiative, Iowa Stops Hunger. Our next session, Federal Nutrition Programs and the COVID-19 emergency, will begin in a moment.
Hello and welcome back. For this session, I am excited to have our federal partners from the USDA Food and Nutrition Service Midwest Region Office with us. Through this conversation, we will look to reflect upon the response of FNS and its federal nutrition assistance programs that responded to the COVID-19 emergency. To begin introductions, I would like to introduce our moderator, Alan Shannon, the Director for Public Affairs in the USDA Food and Nutrition Service Midwest Region Office. Alan directs communications and partnerships in the Midwest for FNS's 15 nutrition assistance programs. Through his work with FNS, he has founded and facilitates 2 networks, one focused on local food systems and the other centered on hunger and nutrition, and comprised of over 500 healthcare providers and related organizations and businesses. Alan?
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you to the summit for allowing us to share the story of what FNS did in response to the pandemic. During today's session, my coworkers and I will share information on the FNS response to the pandemic, which includes program flexibilities and new programs. Our SNAP program director, Julie Mickelson, will talk about the SNAP-related response, and our school meals branch chief, Samia Hamden, will discuss the special nutrition programs response. I'll get us started with a short overview of what our programs are and who we are. So we'll talk about SNAP and COVID-19, school meal and related programs and COVID-19. And then the questions, we'll ask you to submit those via email, and we'll get back to you via email on those. So our mission, USDA's Food and Nutrition Service, we're one of 17 agencies in the Department of Agriculture. We're about 70% of USDA's budget, and we do all the food programs. We have 15 programs, the largest one, SNAP, of course, formerly the Food Stamp Program, school meals, TFAP that works through food banks, food pantries, and soup kitchens, WIC, child and adult care, food distribution on Indian reservations, the summer food service programs, some farmers market programs, and some other smaller programs. Before we get into our program response, I also wanted to mention the Farmers to Families Food Box program. You've probably heard about this. This is not a food and nutrition service program, but it works through food banks, which are primary partners for us. So just wanted to mention that this program has been a critical part of the USDA response. So our programs, we have 7 regions in the Food and Nutrition Service. This is the Midwest region. We have 7 states. Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. And unlike other federal agencies, we don't do any direct program administration. So all of our work involves working through partners, whether that's tribes or state agencies or health agencies. So the pandemic response. Early on, as states, counties, tribes, and partners began to experience the pandemic and related shutdowns and requests for assistance, FNS shifted to response mode and began regular calls and meetings with partners to identify opportunities and flexibilities and to figure out how to operate in this new environment. At the same time, our office in Chicago shifted to virtual, so did many of our states and partners, and that presented an initial challenge, as it did for all of you, but we all figured it out, and here we are today. As I mentioned, for details on our programs and flexibilities, we'll hear from Julie and Samia in a moment. And I just wanted to share a little bit of information on the Farmers to Families Food Box program before we do that. So as part of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, Secretary Perdue announced on April 17th that USDA would exercise its authority under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act to purchase and distribute agricultural products to those in need. Through this program, USDA's Ag Marketing Service, that's the agency over the program, partners with national, regional, and local distributors whose workforces have been significantly impacted by the closure of restaurants, hotels, and other food service businesses to purchase up to $4 billion in fresh produce, dairy, and meat products from American producers of all sizes. The program supplies food boxes of fresh fruits and vegetables, dairy products, meat products, and a combination box of fresh produce, dairy, or meat products. And the distributors package these products into family-sized boxes and then transport them to food banks, community and faith-based organizations, and other nonprofits serving Americans in need. For more information, please see our website, and I've included the link right there. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie now. Julie is our SNAP program director in the Midwest region. As I do, she has years of experience at FNS. She's seasoned, as we say, in the business. She was formerly the director in special nutrition programs. She's got a wealth of experience, and she led the SNAP response, and she's going to talk about that. Julie?
Thanks, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm pleased to share with you today some of the work that we've been doing in SNAP to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wanted to start briefly just talking about DSNAP and whether that was the response that we were looking to. And the short answer is no. But I wanted to share just a little bit about this with you today, because when the pandemic first hit, we got all kinds of inquiries from various governors asking if we could implement a DSNAP program. So a little bit about what DSNAP is. Disaster SNAP is a program that quickly provides temporary food assistance for households that are affected by a natural disaster. A DSNAP typically provides 1 month of benefits to eligible disaster survivors, and it can facilitate the issuance of supplemental SNAP benefits for ongoing households. The Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act provides our Secretary of Agriculture with the authority to operate a DSNAP when an affected area has received a presidential declaration, disaster declaration for individual assistance from FEMA. And let's see. So, it was kind of a natural question, before we had the Corona CARES Act and Family First Act to appropriately respond to the need that was out there. Ironically, we did operate a DSNAP operation in Iowa. Back in August, there was a huge storm called a derecho, and in response to that, we did operate a DSNAP program over 14 sites in 11 counties in the month of September. And that DSNAP operation resulted in over 11 million in benefits. And it was providing benefits to 24,000 households. So if DSNAP was not the appropriate response for the pandemic, what was? Well, we had 3 key flexibilities that I want to share with you. The first was emergency allotments. We approved states to issue emergency allotments to SNAP households that normally receive less than the maximum benefit that is allowable. All of our 7 Midwest states were approved to issue these emergency allotments, including Iowa. We also had a program called online purchasing, and this was something that was operating on a very limited basis before the pandemic hit. And Iowa was one of the few states in the country that was already authorized for online purchasing. But as we worked through the last several months, we were able to rapidly add a number of other states, and nearly every state in the country now is authorized for online purchasing, which of course helps promote social distancing for families in their food purchasing. And then finally, we also launched a brand new program that we call Pandemic EBT, or PEBT for short. I'm going to cover that in more detail in just a moment. But first, I want to cover just some of the additional flexibilities that we were able to provide. The first one was we were able to issue guidance to our states to allow them to suspend the time limit that's associated with able-bodied adults with dependents and the work requirements that are associated with them. So during this national emergency, we were able to suspend those time limits. We also offered a number of flexibilities around application processing, and these were flexibilities around what was required for interviews. We allowed some extended certification periods and some simplified reporting for our state agencies. We also were able to offer flexibilities with our quality control program around claims, fair hearings, flexibilities around replacing cards for households. And we were also able to provide additional flexibility in use of vendors and private contracted staff in call centers in our states. And then finally, Puerto Rico and some of our territories operate the SNAP program a little bit differently. So we were able to provide some block grants to them to provide additional reimbursement, additional funding to help support households during the pandemic. So going back to PEBT, we first operated that in the spring of 2020. And the legislation that we were working with provided benefits for students that were eligible for free or reduced price meals, but they were impacted by the school closures. As you might recall, many of the schools closed down in March, April, May. And so this was an opportunity for us to provide some additional funding through the use of EBT cards for those households. Over the last 6 months, we were able to issue over $77 million worth of benefits in the Midwest region. And I'm sorry, there were 77 million just in the state of Iowa. Across our region, there were about 1.5 billion in benefits provided to these households. So it was very, very expansive program. Under that same legislation, we were able to provide some additional funding that was issued before September 30th, which is the end of our federal fiscal year. So in this case, we were able to provide the same type of benefit to households that were impacted by not being able to attend school full-time. So they were either doing full-time virtual learning or part-time virtual learning. And we were able to have a few states take advantage of that option. Now, coming up this current fiscal year that started in October 1, our continuing resolution legislation authorizes an expansion of this program into school year 21. We are still working out the guidance on this, but this will allow a continuation of benefits for school year 21 in those situations where students are impacted by not being able to attend school full-time or even part-time. As you might imagine, we've worked closely with our child nutrition colleagues to implement PEBT. So I want to turn things over to my colleague Samia, and she can tell you a little bit more about PEBT from the child nutrition perspective. Samia?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about how FNS was able to respond and is continuing to respond during the coronavirus pandemic. So just to kind of continue on the conversation that Julie introduced about PEBT, in March when we were seeing, a growing number of cases with COVID-19, we did start tracking school closures. And what was happening was that there were communities were facing statewide mandated school closures, and it happened very quickly. I remember almost like a domino effect. And FNS did, respond with a wide variety of waivers and other, program expansion, but we want to kind of continue the conversation on PEBT. And as Julie said, this was authorized under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and it did provide benefits to families who have children that were free or reduced price eligible, and provided some benefits on a card to be able to basically purchase food at a grocery store, similar to how they would do that with SNAP. And on the school side, one of the unique challenges that we saw states facing, well, first of all, our colleagues at the Departments of Education around the country had to work very closely with our Departments of Human Services or other agencies that were administering SNAP. So that was one sort of new and unique challenge, was for them to really be able to work very closely together because on the Department of Education side, they were working closely with the schools that operate the National School Lunch Program to be able to gather data on which kids were eligible for free and reduced price meals. And it's not something that is typically maintained at the state level. So you can kind of imagine trying to be able to gather that data in a very quick manner in a time when schools were closed really posed some unique challenges. So states did work really hard to do that and be able to, to share the data and provide the data so that we can ensure that those kids that are eligible for PEBT did in fact eventually get access to those programs. And we continue to work through that this year, as Julie said, with the expansion of PEBT through the end of the school year. So that was one way that FNS was able to respond to some of the school closures and make sure that kids that need food have access to it. In addition, and this was really immediately following all of those statewide closures, on March 20th, FNS did release several waivers authorizing non-congregate feeding in the child nutrition programs, meaning that food could be distributed in a non-congregate setting, which is typically required in the child nutrition programs. And this did include the school lunch program, school breakfast program, the child and adult care food program, and the summer feeding program. And these authorities were given to FNS under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Another waiver that was immediately issued was to allow meals to be served outside of the required meal times. And this was critical because this meant that schools could begin distributing meals to families by either delivering them to their homes, or families could come and pick up meals. So for example, a family could come and pick up a meal on a Monday for all the meals that the family would be eligible for Monday through Friday. So families would not have to come in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They could just come in on Monday and pick up all of the meals that their children were eligible for, which really helped with social distancing and, again, ensuring that meals were served in a very safe manner under the pandemic. The other initial waiver that was authorized was that after-school snacks could be served without an enrichment activity, which is typically required. And again, this was really critical because it meant that families could pick up meals for their children that were eligible. They could pick up a breakfast, a lunch, and an after-school snack all at one time, and possibly multiple days at a time if that's what worked best for that school district. So those flexibilities are really critical, again, in ensuring those kids had access to all of the meals that they were eligible for. And then soon after that, and based on a lot of feedback that we received from our state partners and our local school food authorities, FNS did issue a few more waivers. One of them was allowing parents to be able to pick up meals without their children present. And that was a huge relief, again, because it allowed for more social distancing, less people congregating. So that was very well received. And then another important waiver that was authorized under the Families First Act was to allow schools to deviate from the meal patterns to address any food supply chain disruptions. I think probably all of us can remember back in March or April trying to get to the grocery store and seeing a lot of food shortages and hearing a lot about food chain disruptions. And that really impacted schools significantly because, for example, milk, they were unable to get enough milk to supply to children, the different vegetable requirements that are required under the nutrition standards. So having that waiver in place made sure that schools were able to still provide meals and have the authority to deviate from those meal patterns if they couldn't get access to the certain meal components that are required. Another waiver that FNS also authorized was under the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program, and this program provides fresh fruit and vegetable snacks during the school day for a limited number of schools. And this waiver allowed parents also to be able to pick up those fresh fruit and vegetable snacks without their children present. And it also allowed districts to be able to distribute them at alternate sites if, for example, the school that was originally authorized to operate the program closed because of the pandemic and the district only had maybe 2 or 3 schools operating the meal distribution. This waiver allowed the district to designate a different school to be able to distribute fresh fruit and vegetable snacks. And again, very important for social distancing and making sure that the program reached the children that were eligible to get this fresh fruit and vegetable snack. And that's just a very high level summary of the waivers that FNS issued. Since March, we've had 70 nationwide waivers that have been issued by FNS to, again, ensure that children get the meals that they are eligible for. Many of the 70, I do want to say, are extensions or continuations of what FNS had already issued, and some were newer. And those are all posted on our website, and we'll share the link to our website in case you would like to access those. In addition to the nationwide waivers that FNS has issued, in our region alone, we received 120 individual state waivers submitted to our office in the child nutrition programs that have been reviewed. Some have been approved, and we continue to get state waiver requests. Next slide. Thank you. On the food distribution side, for our TFAP and CSFP programs and our FDPIR programs, we also had additional responses. One way that FNS also responded under food distribution was authorizing the disaster household distributions. These were approved just in our region alone in 4 states, and we had a few tribes as well that operated the disaster household distribution program. These really varied in duration. They were typically approved on a 30-day basis. Some of our states asked for extensions. Iowa was not one of the states that requested a disaster household distributions. They took another strategy to expand access through our TFAP program. But I did want to share that this was in effect, and states and food banks did, select foods from the TFAP program, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, to be able to conduct the disaster household distributions. The type of food that was issued really varied by the state and their own needs. These were submitted as state plans that FNS approved. And these were based on really high risk population or areas, and areas that saw high unemployment, or areas, again, where individuals were high risk under COVID, which could be challenging to try to really hone in on, because of course this is a pandemic. So there were many communities that were impacted by this. And FNS did authorize disaster household distributions for about a 3-month period. And then we started to really encourage our states and partners to move away from disaster household distributions, because these are designed to be more responses to more of a short-term emergency or natural disaster. And of course, this pandemic continues. So what we did was move our states towards really utilizing our existing USDA programs, such as SNAP or the school feeding programs, TFAP, CSFP, FDPIR. These are all designed to be and best equipped to provide more long-term food needs. So that's where we are at now, but we did authorize these disaster household distributions. Next slide, please. So under our food distribution programs, I did want to just highlight a few of the flexibilities that some of our states did utilize, including Iowa. Under the CSFP and TFAP programs, one of the flexibilities that we did allow through state plan amendments is for proxies to pick up food packages, especially for those more high risk. Some of the older populations, a proxy could come and pick up a food package for a participant. Another big change was eliminating the signature requirement when a food package was picked up, and allowing more for a verbal attestation. This could kind of speed things up and make sure that there was just sort of less person-to-person contact, and that was well utilized by many of our states. We also encouraged any sort of electronic technology to use to be able to provide addresses and information that was needed to be able to participate in the TFAP program. One of our states had like a mobile app that they implemented, so we really encouraged technology as much as possible. And then really encouraging creative food distribution models. So for example, a partner could hire a contractor to go out and do food deliveries if there are vulnerable populations that can't come out and pick up their food package. Just allowing participants to come in, not get out of the car, and just placing food in their trunk. And again, utilizing volunteers to be able to do that or deliver food. So, lots of different models out there that were utilized to, again, minimize high-risk populations being exposed, and also minimize that person-to-person contact during the pandemic. And those continue to go on as well. And then in the CSFP program, we did allow some retroactive food distribution. So if a CSFP program operator had to be closed because an employee was infected with COVID and they weren't able to do any food distributions that month, they would submit a request to us and we would allow them to distribute those food packages and then immediately in the next month. And then just to kind of wrap up here, there in the CARES Act and in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, I won't go into too much detail, but in our region alone, there was quite a bit of funding that was made available across the country, but these numbers reflect what was provided in our region, 2 states and our TFAP partners and food distribution program on Indian reservation partners for administrative funding and additional food, money to purchase additional food to be able to respond with the additional folks that became eligible due to unemployment for TFAP and for FDPIR. We were able to provide $1.7 million for equipment and infrastructure to be able to respond to and prevent the coronavirus pandemic. So these are just a few of the areas that we wanted to highlight under food distribution. Again, next slide, you can find all of this information on our FNS website here that Alan has listed, that lists out all the waivers and information about how FNS responded. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, and I'll mention this website is constantly updated. So if you're looking for the latest, you can find that on our website. And if you have questions, here are our email addresses. You can email us directly. You can also put those in the question function that the Hunger Summit has set up. I apologize that we couldn't use the monitor the chat today due to some technical difficulties on my end. So I'm over 30 now, so sometimes I struggle with the technology. So thank you. And I see that Megan has joined us. If you have any closing remarks, let us know. Otherwise, thank you for providing us the opportunity. And thanks to all of you for the work that you do in partnership with us to make sure that Americans got the response they were hoping for from the federal government and their state and local partners. Thanks, Megan.
Alan, thank you so much. I first have to say that I continue each day to think that I've mastered Zoom, mastered technology, and then I get thrown a new challenge. So don't be too hard on yourself there. We'll make sure that all questions to the panelists are emailed to them. So keep sending in any questions you may have. Thank you again, Alan Shannon, Julie Mickelson, Samia Hamden of USDA Food and Nutrition Service Midwest Region. Ending food insecurity is a major challenge. Normally, tackling food insecurity in a global pandemic seems insurmountable. So the mobilization and responsiveness of these programs mentioned today in no short way saved lives. Thank you to the speakers again for this very informative session. We'll make sure to get these resources out to everyone in the Daily Digest as well. We'll continue the conversation in just a minute, where we'll hear from the Feeding Iowans Task Force in the session, Hunger Relief Work During the Pandemic, Private and Public Collaborations Feed Hope. Stay tuned.
Hello again. Our next panel will be and has been organized by the Iowa Food Bank Association in conjunction with the Governor's Feeding Iowans Task Force. Through this discussion, we will address and reflect on the effects of COVID-19 and the mobilization of national, state, and local partnerships that have began through the response to increased need across Iowa. Together, the Feeding Iowans Task Force, led by the Lieutenant Governor Adam Gregg, and other organizations work to bolster charitable feeding programs and social safety net programs to respond to the greater need. But before we begin, I would like to first introduce a brief message from the Governor, Kim Reynolds.
Greetings from our beautiful state capitol, and welcome to this virtual session of the 2020 Iowa Hunger Summit. The 14th annual summit looks a lot different than it has in the past. I'm grateful to President Stinson and her team at the World Food Prize Foundation for finding creative solutions to continue this tradition. Back in 2006, former Governors Ray, Branstad, and Vilsack recognized the strengths of our great state: fertile soils, rich resources, deep roots in agriculture, and of course our greatest asset of all, and that's our people. The Iowa Hunger Summit follows in the spirit of Norman Borlaug. It's a challenge to all of us to question the status quo, to take the resources available and shape them into something better. The power of science is in our hands, and we have the potential to make a difference in our communities, country, and world. I want to thank the panelists with you today, truly an all-star team of folks on the front line of Iowa's hunger fight throughout the pandemic and in the aftermath of the derecho. When I asked Lieutenant Governor Gregg to lead the Feeding Iowans Task Force, we were facing a situation unlike any other our state has ever experienced. The synergy between the Iowa Food Bank Association, the Iowa Department of Agriculture, and our Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, together with the generous spirit of our commodity groups, made the difference between a healthy meal or going hungry for countless Iowans. It's taken creativity, innovation, and a whole lot of teamwork to identify and fill gaps in the food system, to connect Iowans with the resources that they need. They've literally thought outside the box, from repackaging bulk items into smaller meals through a partnership with AmeriCorps, to delivering over 50,000 pounds of ground pork to Iowa food banks by passing the pork with the Iowa Pork Producers Association. Public-private partnerships are behind the success of programs like Beef Up Iowa, Pass the Pork, and Turkey to Table, to name a few. It's a spirit of collaboration that will fuel our path forward. Food insecurity is real. It's estimated that 1 in 10 Iowans and 1 in 7 children struggle with hunger. And that's just unacceptable in a place that is known for feeding the world. So there's more we can do, and that's exactly what this summit is all about. Exploring ideas, monitoring progress, and harnessing the lessons learned throughout 2020 to guide the future. We stand in the shadows of Iowans who have made a real difference. George Washington Carver, Jesse Field Shambaugh, Herbert Hoover, Henry Wallace, and of course, Dr. Norman Borlaug. The world spotlight turns to Iowa every year in October with the awarding of the World Food Prize, the International Borlaug Dialogue, and the Global Youth Institute, all connecting the leaders of today with tomorrow's hunger heroes. So thank you for being a part of this noble tradition by logging in today. Iowa's future and the Borlaug tradition are in excellent hands because of the resourcefulness and heart of each and every one of you. Make this session matter to you, your community, and our state by asking questions, sharing experiences, and renewing your passion for helping others in your hometown. Together, we can feed hope and build an Iowa that's stronger than ever before.
Many thanks to Governor Reynolds for her support of these much-needed conversations. Now I would like to introduce our moderator, the chair of the Feeding Iowans Task Force, Lieutenant Governor Adam Gregg. The Lieutenant Governor, in addition to the Feeding Iowans Task Force, chairs the Governor's Focus Committee on Criminal Justice Reform and is co-chair of the Governor's Empower Rural Iowa Initiative. He has also served as a Hunt Keen Leadership Fellow focused on leadership and education policy and was chosen for the Aspen Institute Rodell Fellowship. We are so glad to have him lead this vital conversation. Lieutenant Governor, over to you.
All right, thank you, Madeline. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to serve you in the role of Lieutenant Governor here in the state of Iowa. And I've been very honored to serve as the chairman of the Feeding Iowans Task Force here during the pandemic. I want to say thank you to Governor Reynolds for kicking us off and summarizing the work that we've done. What a great way to start this conversation and introduce it. And I also hope you'll notice the critical role that she played in our response to the pandemic and the decisions that she's made to support the work of the Feeding Iowans Task Force. I want to say thank you to everybody who's joining this conversation today, and we've got a great panel in store for you. You know, we've all experienced how this pandemic has changed our lives. For one, this annual celebration is taking place virtually instead of in person, which is kind of a bummer, but we're making the best of it here, I think. But more than that, the virus took a serious toll on the lives and livelihoods of Iowans. The economic fallout from this virus caused widespread job loss, supply chain disruptions, and financial stress all up and down the board. This caused many Iowans to face food insecurity, many of them for the first time and through no fault of their own. It was this increase in food insecurity that led Governor Reynolds to create the Feeding Iowans Task Force and task me with chairing it. The Feeding Iowans Task Force is comprised of various experts that bring unique and necessary insight to our conversations, including representatives from various state agencies like the Iowa Department of Agriculture, the Department on Aging, the Departments of Human Services and Public Health, the Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and representatives from Iowa's Food Bank Associations, the Iowa State University, Volunteer Iowa, local food pantries, and many, many other stakeholders. This team has worked creatively to find innovative solutions to the very difficult problems that we faced. We've worked to leverage the unique position that Iowa holds as a leader in ag production and food processing. And you'll see that we set out to build our own mini supply chains to ensure that food was available for those in need, even as we were facing really significant supply chain disruptions. As we go through today's panel, I also hope you'll notice that to a certain extent, this is a story of what didn't happen. There weren't significant food shortages. There weren't serious crisis situations. There was certainly increased need, but we stepped up to meet that need. And as a result of that, fewer Iowans went to bed hungry. This is because we thought proactively and creatively and worked to get the job done with many partners stepping up to play a significant role. I also hope you'll notice as we go through this conversation the way that Governor Reynolds strategically used CARES Act funding to support these efforts. And she had so many different issues and challenges to balance during this pandemic, whether it's been public health challenges, economic challenges, education challenges. But one of those issues that she's prioritized has been hunger and nutrition, and that's why she's allocated $3.9 million of CARES Act funds to support these efforts. Today, we have an expert panel that's joining us, and I'll moderate a discussion with them. Also, I just want you to know that there's going to be Q&A at the end. So my understanding is there's a button just below the screen where you're watching us where you can submit questions for the panel to answer. So at this point, I'm proud to introduce the members of our panel. These are members of the Feeding Iowans Task Force. So we've got Julie Kinney, who serves as the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Linda Gorko, who's the Executive Director of the Iowa Food Bank Association, and we've got Lori Williams, who's an Operations Officer with the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And she has functionally served as the Executive Director of the Feeding Iowans Task Force and helped organize our efforts. So with that, let's just dive right into the conversation. Lori, I'm going to start with you. You help with feeding operations during emergencies and disasters, and that's typically natural disasters. So could you talk about what made this emergency different from what we typically deal with and how we had to change our approach?
All right, first challenge there, I got the mute button, so wonderful. Yes, I'm happy to talk about this question. It's a great one. I think of this in three main differences. Most of the time, as you noted, when there's a major disaster, there's damage to homes, property, electricity may be out, and those feeding responses are typically to pull the groups together and provide what we consider mass feeding operations. That's when you see those canteens, the mobile deliveries, you have the faith-based groups opening up their buildings. We have that congregate style feeding to provide hot meals that are available in the most efficient way possible. However, with the pandemic, congregating in large groups in one place is the opposite of what we need to do. Secondly, this is statewide. The pandemic impacts every county in our state, every home, every feeding operation, really. And in doing that, it requires a much larger response. Typically, if we are looking at a natural disaster such as a flood or a tornado, or if we were to use the derecho for an example, with the derecho, we're looking at 27 counties. With COVID-19, a pandemic, we're looking at 99 counties. And then I'd say probably that third main difference is that with the pandemic, that concern with how it's going to impact our ability to feed activities is and was, maybe I should say that the other way, was and is impacting our entire nation. So from a response perspective, that means that we have limited resources that we can pull from outside to bring in, but it also means that nationwide, everyone is creating a new approach. So taking those differences into consideration, here are a couple actions that we've taken, as you noted, a couple of them. So we were hearing from the Iowa Food Bank Association, from the various food banks, from feeding programs all across the state as they were starting to experience the impacts of COVID-19. And they were projecting out what it was going to look like. And it became pretty clear that we were going to need to develop some kind of a support for feeding operations that were going to cover all populations all services, and what was that going to look like? So that's where that Feeding Iowans Task Force came together. But I also think it's how we have viewed our role in that task force that's different than what we would usually have in, let's say, that national or natural disaster side of things. So if we're looking at those natural disasters, and the derecho is a great example as it's fresh in everyone's mind, we have people who needed feeding activity, or that needed that short-term assistance, like, right? So we're looking at until the electricity is back on, until they can get back into homes that are safe, sanitary, secure. So we're looking at sort of like a Band-Aid during that period of time. But really what we're looking at with the pandemic is something on a much larger side. So with the task force, we've really focused on those current feeding programs that exist and how do we support those in a scalable way over the long run. So instead of creating a new method of bringing out new meal sites, we're really looking at how do you scale up your current services and what are those supports you need. And really, local connections were the key to this. You know, the programs that we're going to talk about are successful because we're still in the middle of them, because those creative solutions were developed based on those who provide these services and what they said they needed. So those local connections, I would say, were very, very key.
Very good. Thank you, Lori. Linda Gorko with the Iowa Food Bank Association. I'm going to go to you next. We see this image here of cars lined up at the Iowa State Fairgrounds as part of a mobile distribution. We talked about there were enormous economic impacts as a result of the pandemic. Will you talk a little bit about what your member food banks experienced, especially in those early days?
Yes, thank you. The movement from with limitations and restrictions, that social distancing was key in the work that we do. We usually do a choice in regards to food that we distribute. We had to move to pivot immediately to distributing boxes of food to people, putting it in there, as you saw in that picture with the mobile distributions. We saw an increase in unemployment. We watched the unemployment claims peaked on April 4th with 64,194 claims. And now through mid-May, it went up to 190,000. So those are indicators we were watching very closely. We're seeing not only low-income families and people that were impacted and needed food, but we're also seeing middle-income families and people, Iowans that were in need of food. Massive increase in the need. The diminished volunteer resources, even though there was more work to put the food in boxes and distribution, we saw a greater need for volunteers. However, our volunteer resources were really very bleak at that time because a senior they're very greatly needed and utilized in volunteer capacity at the food bank. So we had a diminished volunteer resources. We had temporary closures of some feeding sites, the school closures when a school is down, how is the family and the children getting food? We had to coordinate and really try to keep some creativity and strong connections with the education in the schools, senior centers, the aging services moved from mobile to a new model. Food supply chain shortages with the surge of buying, the shift from in-store to curbside purchases. We were experiencing, we do the food banks, 6 food banks across the state, which you can see on the screen, and that serve more than 1,200 nonprofit pantries, had a reduction in the food rescue that we do across the state. And in 2019, our food rescue program was over 14 million meals. That gives you an indication of how much it impacted us, especially in March and April. And that has slowly built up when people, were that leveling off a little bit. But food supply shortages, trucks ordered by the food banks with food that didn't show up, there was big concerns, and also difficulty in sourcing staple foods like, you know, the pasta, the rice, the basics. Working very closely with Feeding America on a national level and state, we were in immediate contact with the government agencies just to let everyone know and also start those connections and what we are going to do to move forward. There's also funding limitations as the nonprofit food banks saw a surge in need. We were purchasing food with no funds. So we had to have the faith and the strength of Iowa that it will be made up, and we're just going to make it happen. So we went to strict protection protocols for the volunteers and employees. No food bank shut down at any time. If one of the wonderful pantries that we work with in our pantry network, if they were unable to keep going, we tried to work with them to make sure we got served their people. But really, when you look at across the state, people did some great things. But it was nationwide and across the Iowa. You know, we had some mass food drives, and it really made an impact on us immediately. And we were looking out and how that will affect people across the state in the coming years. At a critical point, it was like 2.5 times increase in needs. So that gives you an idea of the impact and what was happening in the early days, and why we moved so fast to ensure that, like you said, that we tried to curb the negative impact on our state as much as possible.
Well, thank you, Linda. Between your comments and Lori's comments, I think that really lays out the unique and vexing challenges that we were facing here in Iowa, and how this pandemic presented, you know, totally new problems that we needed to solve. Julie Kenny, the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, I'm going to go to you. First of all, your department administers a number of the programs that were stood up as a result of the Feeding Iowans Task Force. And probably the first major one that we stood up was the Pass the Pork initiative. And speaking of challenges, the pork industry was facing some really extreme challenges, particularly at the time that we stood up that program. So could you talk about what those challenges were, and how the Pass the Pork initiative, number one, helped us solve the problem of getting more protein into the hands of those in need, but also gave that industry some much needed good news?
Yeah, thanks, Lieutenant Governor, and thanks for hosting this important discussion on some of the feeding initiatives that are happening across the state. It's great to be here today on behalf of Iowa Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Naig. He has made these programs a priority and really supported our efforts throughout the initiative in this pandemic. You raised some really important considerations for the pork industry in particular. In your opening comments, you talked about how we lead in production and we lead in processing, and that is so true in the pork industry here in Iowa. We are the leading state in terms of pork production and pork processing capacity. But what we saw when the pandemic started is that we had some real supply chain disruptions. We had disruptions at some of those processing locations, which created a backup on the farm and throughout the whole supply chain. And so what we found at the farm level was we had pigs that were ready to go to market and really nowhere to go. And so the economics were also tough and continue to be tough in pork production here in the state and across the country. And one thing that we are so proud of is that while these times were extremely difficult and uncertain for the entire pork industry, but pig farmers in particular, they were the first ones, among the first ones to raise their hand and say, what can we do? How can we be sure that we're helping our neighbors and helping fellow Iowans be sure that they have enough to eat and have high quality protein? And so when those calls started, we worked with Iowa Pork Producers Association to come up with this program, and are really grateful for the support of Governor Reynolds, Lieutenant Governor Gregg, and the entire Feeding Iowans Task Force, and the funds that came to help support it. We had pig farmers across the state donate almost 500 of their pigs that were ready for market for this. And so what we did was we took some of those pigs, found local meat lockers in different parts across the state, and those meat lockers were also seeing unprecedented demand for their services. But what they were also willing to do was to say, you know what, we'll work some nights, we'll work some weekends, we'll squeeze some of these pigs in for the broader good. And so really, really proud of our meat processing industry as well for stepping up to the plate for this. And so We continue the project now. We started it back in, probably April or May, and continue to process pigs as part of this program. And so far, about 200,000 meals have been distributed as part of this program. So a great way for us to leverage our outstanding production and then our processing capacity as well. And I'd really be remiss if we didn't also mention Iowa State University stepping up to the plate on this one in particular. I mentioned our local meat lockers, how, man, the demand for their services, many of them were booking out a year, maybe even 18 months, 2 years out in advance. And so Iowa State University came up and said, you know what, we'll open up our meat lab. We will do some processing here with some of our students and help to get some of these animals through in this very important high quality protein in the hands of Iowans in need. So across the board, across the supply chain, this is a great example of people coming together and really helping to meet those local needs.
Outstanding. Thanks, Julie. We're really proud of this program, and it's really remarkable how quickly it was stood up and how quickly we were able to get this meat into the hands of those who need it. I'll remind those who are watching, you do have the ability to submit questions to the panel. There's a button right underneath the video bar there where you can submit a question to us, and we'll be happy to answer those as we get to the end of this presentation. With that, my next question is going to go to Lori. One of the challenges that Linda Gorko mentioned was that food banks were having a difficulty in acquiring some of the normal shelf-stable food items that you might expect to get at a food bank. And your department, the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, worked with the Iowa Food Bank Association and created quite a partnership that involves the bulk purchase of shelf-stable food items and repackaging that food into sizes that would be useful for families. It also required a unique partnership with AmeriCorps here in the state of Iowa. So could you tell us a little bit about those efforts?
Yes, this has been a great partnership. So the funding for this project came from the CARES Act. Governor Reynolds allocated $1 million of CARES Act funding for the purposes of this. And the funds have gone to the purchasing of those food products that have been among the hardest to source during this time. So that's, as Linda started to note, the pasta, the rice, the oats, some alternative protein sources, for example. And then acquiring these during this time has been difficult to get them in regular serving sizes that are manageable, not only for pantries and meal sites, but we also, as we talk about the school system and other methods, we also looked at how we could use larger bulk products within our own ag that we have here within our state. And it became quite apparent that we might, with some AmeriCorps support and others, be able to take a larger system and break it down and be more manageable here. So that's really where this has gone. So with this project, we purchased these larger products in bulk, and then AmeriCorps NCCC members and other fantastic community volunteers across the state have helped repackage the products into those smaller manageable serving sizes. Since April, more than 700 volunteers have dedicated their time, and that's more than 7,000 hours, volunteer hours right there. And of those hours, I will say 70% has been those AmeriCorps NCCC members. We could not possibly accomplish this project in the short amount of time that we are looking at without the AmeriCorps NCCC. And for those who may not know, we happen to have within Iowa an NCCC campus right in Benton. So we are extremely fortunate. It's located close enough to the Northeast Iowa Food Bank that we've been able to make this very successful. And that's where part of the packaging is taking place. So we have the repackaging in the Northeast Iowa Food Bank of Iowa, and also Food Bank of Heartland. They are using their clean rooms to help take that product, repackage it, relabel it, and then distribute it across the state. And so we are in the middle of that project. It's ongoing for another month or so, and we'll have more figures at that point. But at this point in time, we've repackaged nearly 500,000 pounds of food and have distributed more than 330 pounds.
Outstanding. Well, that's certainly a partnership that we're very proud of, and we're very, as you said, Lori, very fortunate that we have a AmeriCorps NCCC campus right here in Iowa. This is just another example of leveraging the unique assets that we have in Iowa to assist in our response. And I totally agree with your assessment that it really couldn't have happened, and certainly not to this scale, without the help of those AmeriCorps workers. And I'm glad we were able to make that connection. And there are other players who helped us do that, who are part of the Feeding Iowans Task Force. Volunteer Iowa is one of the organizations that's involved, and they've got close relationships with AmeriCorps. So another really important initiative from the Feeding Iowans Task Force. Linda Gorko, I'm going to come to you next. You mentioned in your opening remarks that staffing became a really vexing challenge, right? Right at the time when we need help the most, and the system for distributing food was forced to change, is right at the time when the volunteer base kind of crumbled. You had seniors who were being cautious, very justifiably. You have businesses that were doing fewer business outings. So could you talk about the various ways that we've sought to address that? And one of the ways that we know impacted that was Governor Reynolds' deployment of the National Guard. So could you talk a little bit about the creative ways that the food banks are addressing that and the impact of the Guard?
Well, I can say, first off, absolutely, the National Guard was game-changing in the food bank's ability to serve the need of the state. The National Guard was deployed to 5 of the 6 food banks across the state of Iowa. They were integral in the ability to serve. The deployment began in April, late April, and went through, I think the last group left in August, with some different end times, start times and end times, but they were integral in ensuring that food was distributed to the rural areas. They needed more food with the variety of things taking place across the state. We needed to make sure that our rural Iowa was served, and they were phenomenal in that. The manpower, the vehicles for distribution, and the coordination and the logistics. They helped with the frozen and fresh produce boxes, and they made them and helped distribute them. In fact, they built more than 19,300 food boxes, which are frozen, fresh, and shelf-stable boxes. And we can't thank them enough for what they did. When we talk about heroes, they really were the heroes. I think you saw at one point the food bank directors getting very emotional because if we're not able to serve the pantries and serve the community, that puts a lot of stress on the food banks. So that was integral. We had, like I said, 2 specific food banks that had an extended support due to the rural makeup of their area. And when you're looking at the impact across the state, the 6 food banks had a 40% increase in distribution statewide. That could not have happened without the National Guard. And also when you talk about the AmeriCorps, they were integral in helping in a variety of different ways. Volunteers that did come, we did have food banks have volunteers that did come at certain points. So any volunteer, I know at the Food Bank of Iowa, they have done a phenomenal job of all the volunteers, and the support, the private and public partnerships have been incredible. And it shows what we can do together. When we thought we were alone, we really aren't. And I think we do it together. We distribute food across the state together. And this is exemplifies when you're talking about the near misses that we had. It's because we're part of Iowa, and that makes it all come together. Food banks had distributed 1 million more meals a month than the average month last year. It's pretty consistent over the last 5 months. So as we track the numbers, they don't lie for us of it has to be done, the work has to be done. So they were very important in making those distributions possible.
Outstanding. Thank you, Linda. Yes, we're certainly appreciative of Governor Reynolds' decision to deploy the National Guard. It really helped us step up our game in terms of this response. And one of the things I especially appreciate about our Guard members is they're really 2-time volunteers, right? They volunteered for Guard duty to begin with, but then those who were part of this response had specifically volunteered to be part of the COVID response. And that's amidst a number of other deployments overseas, et cetera. So I really appreciate the way that the men and women of the National Guard stepped up to help their fellow Iowans, and certainly something I won't soon forget. Julie, I'm going to come back to you and talk a little bit about a few of the other programs that the Department of Agriculture has administered during this pandemic. Pass the Pork isn't the only program. We've also done things around the beef industry and the turkey industry as well. And a quick side note, I actually came straight from the Food Bank of Iowa, where they were accepting a delivery of 37,000 pounds of turkey from West Liberty Foods. And that was a pretty special thing to be a part of this morning. Julie, could you fill us in on what those programs look like and how we've supported those industries?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. We talked earlier about Pass the Pork. I will give credit to Secretary Neg and Lieutenant Governor Gregg, to you. Both of you said, this is great what we're doing in pork. How do we leverage this in other areas of agriculture where we also lead? And so we very quickly mobilized our team and thought of beef and turkey specifically. How do we get that type of high quality protein into these food banks and food pantries as well? And so that's where Beef Up Iowa really came from, is trying to leverage what we had learned and achieved through Pass the Pork, but making it work with the beef industry. One of the other dynamics that was happening at this same time is we obviously have a tremendously strong 4-H and FFA youth programs across the state. And county fairs and the state fair are so important to those counties and maybe more importantly to the kids who show animals and have exhibits at each one of those fairs. Well, as you might imagine, there were some changes made to county fairs and to the state fair. And so for some students who had steers that they had planned to process at their local locker, they may no longer have had space for those animals to be processed. And so one of the things that we tried to do with Beef Up Iowa was to work with those 4-H and FFA students and offer up this opportunity to where if they wanted their steer to be part of these feeding programs, then once again, Iowa State University stepped up to the plate. These students could deliver their steers to Iowa State, get them processed at Iowa State, and then through the generous efforts of the Food Bank Association and the food banks, we would get that ground beef in the hands of those who need it most. So it's been tremendously successful. You can see here on the slide, 66 steers have already been processed at Iowa State University, and we continue to do that as we work through this. Again, thank you to Iowa State. The other youth engagement piece in this program is that we're also training people in the animal science department at Iowa State. So they're learning how do we process these animals, and then those ground beef is going into these food bank and food pantry feeding programs. I have appreciated seeing the students who are part of this, the 4-H members. Some of them have visited their local food pantries where some of this ground beef has been delivered, and they can really make the connection to how is what I'm raising on the farm making a difference for folks in my community, and maybe open their eyes to people who are in need that they maybe didn't realize in the first place. So thank you to the Iowa Beef Industry Council, the Iowa Cattlemen's Foundation, and everyone who's been part of Beef Up Iowa. We continue to process animals at Iowa State, and it's been just tremendous success. Maybe now I'll pivot over to the turkey program, Turkey to Table. Lieutenant Governor, you mentioned you just came from the Food Bank of Iowa for one of those great deliveries. We can't lose sight of some of the challenges that our turkey farmers have also faced as a result of the pandemic. We are leaders in turkey production. However, a lot of the turkey that's produced and processed in the state of Iowa goes towards sandwich meat. So if you go to a sandwich shop like a Subway or a Jimmy John's or something like that and order a turkey sandwich, chances are that turkey was produced and processed here in the state of Iowa. Well, as you might imagine, the pandemic created some significant supply chain challenges when some of those shops were closed or the demand for that meat went away or subsided at least. And so one thing we've been able to do as part of a CARES Act funding allocation from the governor and lieutenant governor is take some of those funds and purchase some of that turkey and get it into our food bank and food pantry feeding program. So Iowa raised turkey, Iowa processed turkey, again, getting it into food pantries and in the hands of those who really need a high quality protein source. And Linda, you know this better than any of us, but what we hear from the food banks and food pantries is protein is in really strong demand at food pantries. And so I think whether it's Pass the Pork or the turkey program or Beef Up Iowa, they're all good examples of taking what we produce so well on the farm and getting it in the hands of those in need.
Outstanding. Again, two more programs that we're very proud of. And I like the way that we've been able to, with the Beef Up Iowa, support the youth by purchasing from 4-H and FFA students. But then with Turkey to Table, these are purchases that are so far have come from West Liberty Foods, an Iowa company owned by Iowa turkey growers. And so a way we're both meeting the needs for those who are in need, but also providing some demand for an industry that was impacted by COVID-19 as well. Lori, next I'm going to come to you. As if the global pandemic wasn't enough, this is 2020 after all. So Iowa also had perhaps its worst and most widespread natural disaster in history when the derecho came through in August. We were hit by this massive windstorm with virtually no warning and winds of over 140 miles per hour in some places. There was serious destruction, widespread, gigantic impact on homes, on farms, businesses. There's loss of electricity and displaced Iowans. This was very much more that traditional feeling disaster that we're used to dealing with, but very non-traditional setting in the fact that there was a global pandemic that was going on at the same time. So could you talk about how the work we were doing through the Feeding Iowans Task Force elevated our response to the derecho?
Yes, absolutely. So this has been quite the year. I'll be honest, we're amongst friends, right? I was hoping we get skipped and we could learn best practices on how to do this during a pandemic from others. However, Midwest, we're going to run with this. So as I mentioned earlier, and as Lieutenant Governor was just noting, a COVID-19 response is different because best practices typically lend toward that mass feeding activities. And that's not something that we can do right now. So when we can't do our normal processes, how are we going to go about doing this? Well, we're Iowans. Everyone's going to chip in. That's kind of how this played out, and it's not surprising at all. And I have to be very thankful to everybody, and I'll mention some pieces here. So with the derecho, we had widespread power outages lasting multiple days, in some areas more than a week, right? And again, we had feeding operations, feeding organizations who were impacted. So we had them without power. Some had limited mobility. So due to the debris, could not get out and about. They had their own staff who were impacted. And we had 27 counties with this need. So remove COVID-19, this is already a huge disaster. Add COVID-19, Lori's wondering why this is the year that we have to come up with new strategies. So lots of different factors here. So the partnerships with the Feeding Iowans Task Force were so incredibly valuable, and I could probably write a whole paper on all the ways, just for me, from my perspective. But one of the most important that I will say is that in the emergency management field, we will note over and over and over again, we want to exchange those business cards before the disaster. It's not time to build the relationships during it, although you'll do your best, but we want to do that before the disaster. And in this case, if we were to look at a silver lining, we had that before the derecho happened. So a case in point with this that I was just beaming with is before I even got to the point to reach out to the food bank side and say, how are you doing? Hey, Cat Food Reservoir, how are you doing? You're right there in that Cedar Rapids area that's got so heavily impacted. Before that even happened, the board of directors from the Iowa Food Bank Association was contacting me saying, Lori, here's our situation. And by the way, Linda Gorko lives in Cedar Rapids and is going to be out of pocket for a little bit. So don't reach out to Linda, reach out to me instead. So they were already navigating through their system, telling me the status of each of the food banks, what they could do, what they couldn't do. And if they needed something, they'd be back in touch. So then I didn't need to be thinking from my perspective, I need to check on that. I could go check on some of the others instead and know that they were going to reach out to me. Flip that around. For them, they knew who to go to. So that was what I kept hearing too when I came back to the Feeding Iowans Task Force and said, okay, let me report out on what just has happened in the last week. And here's how you guys have been so incredibly valuable to me. And I heard back, well, hey, we knew what to come to you. Like, we knew you were a point of contact. We also knew how we were all connected, how all the different partners worked together. So that was also very valuable. Another piece I will point out here is not only did we have the relationships, but we knew what to ask. We knew the type of questions. We also knew what each other could bring to the table for resources. So when I look at vulnerable populations, when a disaster occurs, and I want to be sure that there isn't a population that's getting missed in it, I now have a really great contact with Department of Aging that I can check in and say, how are those area agencies on aging doing? Is there something you need? I know you're already connected with the food banks, but what else is there? Do you need information? Are people stranded? Kind of what do you need in there? So they now know what questions to bring to me. And the other piece is they can validate, they can provide on the ground information. So I'm not just getting whatever may be in the media, I'm not just getting little reports from here and there, but I'm getting it straight from sources who are getting it straight from their folks saying, the most important thing I need is this, and I'm going to need it by this because it's going to impact this group. And that's the most helpful thing for me in an emergency management side, is to understand those pieces. And then we already know how to communicate together. So I'd say my takeaway was the partnerships are working, and I don't want to lose those partnerships. Everyone is very transparent. We have a very open group. No one needs to defend any situation. No one needs to come in and say, I need this. I know I should have had it. I mean, that's not how we are all about how we can work together. And then we can brainstorm. And I think that's where we've gotten our solutions from. And then I would say one last benefit, although I could go on, like I said, forever, but one last benefit I would mention is that from the derecho response, even on top of our COVID-19 response, I would say we have an even better idea of what resources we have within our state. The response from grocers, foundations, social service organizations. You know, we know Iowans come together, but it has opened my eyes to alternative ways we can kind of look at things. So not only have we looked at a pandemic that is a longer span, covering, as I mentioned earlier, the entire state, every person is impacted. We can also look at what has an acute level of pain here that's short-lived, that came out of nowhere, and how do we respond? So very different disasters. And I'd say that we have a better idea of now within our state, different resources available to come together. We can ask questions we never thought we could ask before because we are so used to thinking out of the box now that sort of those traditional methods I have to remember now. Be like, oh wait, I might be able to tie in a normal method now instead of thinking outside. But I am very grateful for all of our partners in the state. And I just have to continue to mention those grocers, the foundations, all those different social service groups. Iowans are neighbors, and that's a huge takeaway.
Absolutely. Well, we're very grateful for the work of the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management all throughout the pandemic, but also when you layer on the derecho on top of that, and certainly have always had an appreciation for that, but a newfound one. And specifically for you, Lori. Lori is somebody who gets things done, and we've definitely learned that. Those of us who serve on the task force have seen how effective Lori can be. So thank you for your work. Linda Gorkel, one of the challenges that you mentioned was financial. And how, especially early on, it was unclear what the finances were going to be for the food banks. As it turned out, there have been some pretty significant financial resources that have been made available. The governor allocated $1 million of the Coronavirus Response Fund, which is a $1.25 billion fund that governors and states had discretion on how to utilize. But on top of that, there were also additional resources through the TFAP program. There was a new CFAP program. So can you talk about how the various programs that the food banks manage work together to provide the resources and kind of give us an idea of what needs still exist?
Absolutely. Well, we work and looking at what has transpired with the pandemic and also the derecho, we have seen some unique challenges. The CARES Act funds really has gone towards reimbursing for food and distribution costs that increased. So we had like the PPE, the boxes, because we went from full distribution without boxes. We realized we had to get boxes. And then also the purchasing of foods such as fruits and vegetables and things like that. So that's the CARES Act funding really made an impact on that and helped us with that ability to do that. And TFAP with this did the same. The food banks serving Iowa distributed more than 5 million pounds of food from the CFAP program. And it's expected that, which is going to end in October, additional 363,000 pounds. So sending those out to the 1,200 pantries across the state of Iowa that serve the 99 counties, that was substantial in our ability to serve and provide healthy food to those across the state. And we look for new opportunities. It's the public-private partnerships that people stepped up. Additional food has been vital. As we look at the TFAP trade mitigation coming to an end, which we received more food the last several years, we're starting to see what's going to happen in the future, and we're seeing the possible decline in that. So the resources that we had when we needed it were incredible to help us ensure that food still got to Iowans. The pandemic, like I had mentioned before, is expected to increase the food insecurity for years to come. As we knew, there was food insecurity in every county in Iowa before the pandemic, but it's increased that. And it's basically grown 2 times. We anticipated how impacting the state for years to come. So we all of the funds that were provided did make a positive impact for Iowans seeking food, and it was vital in ensuring that food insecurity was kept to. If people wanted it, hopefully they were able to find it and receive the food that's needed. So.
Outstanding. Julie, I'm going to come to you now. Another one of the programs that the Department of Agriculture administers focused on refrigeration for food pantries using CARES Act funds as well. So can you talk a little bit about the purpose of that program and also about the partnership with Iowa's egg producers that kind of comes hand in hand with that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll touch briefly kind of on the Pack the Pantry program. We've talked about our leadership in pork and other areas of agriculture, but we are also the #1 egg producer in the country by far. The state of Iowa produces just a whole lot of eggs and egg products. And so another really good high quality protein source. And so one thing we tried to figure out was, how do we enable things like eggs and dairy and produce to get into these food pantries and meet the needs, the increasing demands that Linda's outlined so incredibly well. And we quickly figured out by talking to food pantries that refrigeration units were a limiting factor. Some of them did not have refrigeration at all, had very, very aged units, or simply needed more capacity. And so with the $440,000 in CARES Act funds that the governor allocated to this program, we were able to administer grants to 113 food pantries in 51 Iowa counties. And so many of them have already purchased their refrigeration units. We're hearing and seeing the impact of that at the local food pantry level. And then, Lieutenant Governor, you mentioned some of the generosity of our egg producers. So they also were looking for ways to help, despite some of the tremendous challenges that they faced with supply chain disruptions. And so even before the pandemic, they were donating 35,000 dozen eggs every single month toward feeding programs. And so when the pandemic happened, they upped that to 45,000 dozen eggs a month. And so one thing we've been doing is working to get those eggs into these new refrigeration units at the local food pantry levels. And so it's been a good partnership at the local level. We have these new units in 51 Iowa counties and are working to get eggs and dairy and produce into those food pantries. So I think it's making a huge impact at the local level and certainly a good connection point for our farmers in those communities.
Well, it's really important. We've stood up these programs on getting donated beef and pork and turkey and eggs into the food bank system and through that to the pantries. We want to make sure that they're able to accept that and be able to store that for a period of time so that those who are accessing those pantries have the ability to get the fresh protein that's available to them. So I thought this was an important connector. And the other thing I like about this program is this lasts beyond the pandemic, right? I think the Beef Up Iowa and Pass the Pork have been very important in generating thousands of pounds of ground beef and ground pork and the turkey purchases. But once those are used up, those are used up. This is capacity that will exist hopefully long after the immediate crisis has gone away. I want to again provide a reminder to those who are watching that you do have the ability to ask questions and submit them. My understanding is there's a button right underneath the screen where you can click and you can submit your questions. We do have some questions coming in, and I will kind of summarize these and ask them to the panelists. First of all, this is a question on the school impact, right? Because the schools are an important place where kids are able to access nutrition, and with schools being closed last spring, that caused some real challenges in that realm. So I think Linda Gorkel, I'm going to go to you. Can you talk a little bit about the school feeding operations and how that got stood up very quickly, and some of the funds that are actually outside of the $3.9 million that I've already referenced that have gone to support some of the school feeding operations that were stood up very quickly?
Sure, I can touch a little bit on it. We have some miracle workers in our Department of Education in the state of Iowa that are doing incredible work. Kayla, who was on our team, she really kept us up to date on things, and this is how pervasive our group worked, that we were able to communicate. But the USDA waivers that allow schools, districts, public and non-public, to offer this summer food service program or the National School Lunch Program through December this year, or the school year. It's been challenging, and the administrative work has been putting them to task, but they have made a very, very grand effort making sure kids get food. 2,290 school districts, public and non-public, are in the summer food service program and have elected to do so through the fall as well. And 80 new schools are non-public who didn't receive the spring and summer are now taking part of it, and reimbursement rate is higher than this. The school feeding program. So it is a huge lift in administratively, but they've done enormous things. And I know the food banks have been working with them with Operation Backpack, and how things can we wrap around those students across the state also. So they've been doing incredible work.
Outstanding. So there are a couple questions here regarding, access to nutritious food, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the protein programs that have been stood up. And so a number of folks are asking about, how we track nutrition and things like that. It reminds me of some of the work that we've done around Double Up Food Bucks to support access to fresh fruits and vegetables. I thought, Deputy Secretary Kinney, could you give us an update a little bit on the Double Up Food Bucks program and the impact that that's had?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. And I'm sure many are familiar with the Double Up Food Bucks program, but essentially what this does is take folks who are using SNAP benefits. So if they spend $10 in SNAP benefits, then they can get that matched with another $10 to purchase locally grown fruits and vegetables. And so this program is administered by the Iowa's Healthiest State Initiative. They do a great job of getting this facilitated through things like farmers markets. Some of our grocers, including Fairway and Hy-Vee, have really embraced this. And so it's a really good opportunity, again, to connect some of our specialty crop farmers, those who are producing high quality fruits and vegetables, and get that nutritious food in the hands of those who need it. So it's a way to stretch some of those SNAP benefits and dollars and help them get some fresh fruits and vegetables. And this was made possible and really extended through an allocation again from the governor and lieutenant governor with some of those CARES Act funds. So really important initiative that started before the pandemic, but really kind of got a shot in the arm with some additional funding as part of these CARES Act funds.
Very good. I think one more question here, just real quick. I guess this is a comment that I'm going to highlight, but from Sherry Doan at Central College, she just real shout out to the work of AmeriCorps and being a partner, and Volunteer Iowa and being a partner, and just notes how much she appreciates seeing that type of partnership. One thing that reminds me of, though, there's another aspect that AmeriCorps has been a part of, and that's gleaning efforts. Lori Williams, I'm going to go to you. Could you just quickly summarize some of the gleaning efforts that we've been able to put together that's flown under the radar, but I think is really important?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to tag on to Deputy Kenny's remarks there as well on the nutrition side. So something to consider in here is the gleaning side of things. We were approached on the task force asking maybe if there was a role that could be played here. So with the Feeding Iowans Task Force, we helped, especially with Volunteer Iowa's leadership, really engage with that and developed an Iowa Gleaning Network, which allowed expanding the current gleaning operations to develop new gleaning locations. So there are now 8 sites across the state. And with that, really the purpose of that is to recover those valuable fresh fruits and veggies that are left on the fields of local farms. So they were able to, I'm talking fast since we're near the end, but they were able to get out about 21,000 pounds of fresh valued food, produce. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I have to read it. But the fresh produce valued at more than $50,000. So that went to hungry Iowans. It goes straight to pantries, and that allows it, they can't really get through the whole food bank process. It would spoil before then. So it gets it straight from those local farms to the pantries out to Iowans. It's been incredibly successful, and it will continue. It has the capability to continue every summer. So a great initiative. Thanks to Volunteer Iowa for helping make that possible.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for letting us be a part of this. Thank you to the panelists for all your work and for presenting everything that we've been doing here in Iowa. I hope those who are watching can see how we've thought creatively, worked proactively, worked quickly to deal with some very unprecedented challenges. And again, in some ways, I'd emphasize this is a story of what didn't happen. Yes, there was significantly increased demand, but we were able to leverage Iowa's role as a leader in ag production and food processing to be able to meet that demand, and really proud of those efforts. And I think our challenge going forward is we need to keep this conversation going. I think we've got some great private sector efforts that are going on through our nonprofits, through generous corporate donors. The Business Publications Corporation has an effort called Iowa Stops Hunger with Hy-Vee as a lead sponsor, where they're going to try to keep this conversation moving forward. The Greater Des Moines Partnership, I know, has expressed interest. And of course, today's Hunger Summit is a great example of continued dialogue around these important issues and the needs that still exist, that existed before the pandemic, and will likely exist afterwards. But we're going to do everything that we can to make sure that we minimize and mitigate those challenges. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. Thanks again to the panelists for being a part of this. And thank you to all the Iowans who have stepped up amidst this pandemic to help your neighbors in need. It's an honor to serve as the Lieutenant Governor, and it's an honor to serve as the Chairman of the Feeding Iowans Task Force.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. It was such a pleasure to have you all here today, and it was so great to hear of the innovative and thoughtful initiatives you all have come up with to feed Iowans over the past 7 months. For me, this was really the first time I was really able to digest and understand the images you provided from the fairgrounds and other mobile pantries. It was such an impactful narrative. I look forward to continuing to follow all of your work and to seek to find more solutions to the ever increasing need. Looking towards tomorrow and continued recovery into a more long-term strategy, I'm really excited for the conversation we'll have with 2 of Iowa's food bank executives and members of the National Council of Feeding America, Barb Prather and Mike Miller, on really like what's next, where are we going from here, how do we focus on the need for further resilience within our food systems. Additionally, as you mentioned, we'll be talking even more about the Double Up Food Bucks initiative and its receipt of $1 million of the CARES Act funding, in addition to a keynote presentation from the Director Director, Civil and Human Rights Commission here in Des Moines, Joshua Barr. He will provide a supportive discussion on the 5 actions organized communities can fight for to improve food access at the local level. And just as a reminder now, as we break it before our afternoon sessions, I want to provide a little note to reconnect back here at 2 p.m. at www.iowahungersummit.org/live. There on that page, you'll be able to decide which session you'd like to attend and directly connect via that page. Thank you all, and I hope to see you later.